on, I'm really, oh, right, I think that's just telling us if we're being recorded. With my FEA hat on, I'm really pleased to see all of you here today, and really grateful for your involvement and all the support that you have given to our organisation. So before we hear from our 2021 innovation winners, I wanted to set some of the context about why supporting disadvantaged young people is so important and why now. So back in 2019, if we can think about life before the pandemic, and I know that that is hard to think about now, but before the pandemic even hit, disadvantaged young people, by the time they left secondary school, they were already on average 18 months behind their more affluent peers. And that gap was much wider in some parts of the country as well. So if we look at areas that we think of as coal spot areas, Blackpool, Knowsley, Middlesbrough in particular, the gap was much wider and knocking on 2 years in some of those cases. And it was also growing before the pandemic. So we'd noted that in the over the decade leading up to the pandemic, although there'd been an overall closing of the gap, particularly in primary, those last few years leading up to 2019, we were seeing the gap begin to open again, particularly at secondary. We were beginning to see inequalities widen, in other words. And we know since 2019 that the pandemic has had a significant impact on disadvantaged pupils in particular, thereby contributing to the growth of that gap. Again, some work that EPI has done over the course of this year has found that while there has been learning loss for all children across the country, again on average, the average learning loss for disadvantaged young people has been much greater, particularly in reading and maths. And we all also know that disadvantaged young people are at greater risk of exclusion and managed moves. So those young people who are eligible for free school meals, who are looked after by the state, or who are from Black Caribbean backgrounds, are much more likely to be subject to a school exclusion or a managed move out of school. And finally, we know that outside of London, there's also an inequality in access to qualified teachers. So only about 17% of physics teachers in the poorest areas outside of London have a relevant degree. So inequalities are impacting on our young people in a number of different ways. And that's why it's important for me, as CEO of the Education Policy Institute and as a trustee of the Fair Education Alliance, to be able to galvanise evidence and innovation to look at how we can begin to crack this problem. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the award winners because they are the stars of today. I'm going to introduce you, and I think what I'll do is ask each of you to give your 3-minute presentation as I introduce you, rather than come back, if that makes sense. So we will start first with Sinead from Lighthouse.
Thanks very much, Natalie, and thanks so much for sharing your thoughts on some of those key issues. It's really fascinating to hear about those. So at Lighthouse, we believe children in care should have the same opportunities as everyone else. So there are about 82,000 children in state care in England, which means the government legally acts as their parent. Now, almost 90% of those will be placed with a foster family, but for around 10% of children, they can't be safely supported by a foster family and they live in a children's home. Children can come into care for a whole range of reasons, but for the vast majority, they're in care as a result of abuse, neglect, and family dysfunction. Yet, despite these being some of the most vulnerable in our society, in many ways, the residential care system is broken. Pre-care experiences, a culture of low expectations for these groups, and a lack of resource and funding in the care sector directly impacts young people, and we see drastically worse outcomes for this group when compared with their peers. So to give you a couple of examples of those in care are 15 times less likely than their peers to get 5 or more good GCSEs, yet 50 times more likely to end up in prison, and 60 times more likely to experience homelessness. One of the big challenges facing the sector is that staff who are working in residential care aren't getting the support they need to help these young people to grow and flourish. Now, when thinking about the workforce, there are kind of 3 key challenges. Firstly, the prescribed qualification that residential care staff have to do isn't fit for purpose. So this is resulting in staff who aren't equipped with the specialist skills and knowledge that they need to support these young people in their care. Secondly, there can be a lack of reward and recognition for what can be really challenging work, and that can lead to low morale, contribute to lower feelings of well-being in the workforce. Thirdly, when we look at a career in residential care, there is a lack of career pathways, and it can be difficult for staff to progress. And this means that this can stop people from staying in a career in residential care. When you take those 3 things together, what we see in the sector is there are hugely high rates of turnover and staff leaving the profession. This ultimately creates instability for young people. Now, often the pre-care experiences for these young people mean that they can find it really challenging to build relationships. And this constant churn in staff only reinforces feelings of abandonment and rejection by the people who are there and supposed to be caring for them. So what is the solution? So through the Intrapreneurship Award, our solution is to empower staff to best support young people in care to thrive. And we'll do this through a programme of support and training to make care more relationship-based and more responsive to the needs of young people. We've seen from research across Europe that when staff are supported and have what they need to do the role, quality of care can increase and stability of placements can increase. And through this, it provides young people with a secure attachment, a trusted adult in their life, and also provides continuity in other areas such as their schooling and their friendship groups and their community. I just wanted to close with why I believe it's so important that we empower the staff who work with these young people to enable them to achieve their goals. So children in residential care have a huge amount of potential. Many of them have faced huge challenges in their early years, and they've had to develop a huge amount of resilience just to cope with the challenges that growing up in care presents. So in the right environment and nurtured in the right way, these experiences can give them the potential to achieve a lot when they leave care. And that's why it's so crucial for us that we provide that support to the staff to help these young people to grow and to flourish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sinead. I think there's a lot of support and recognition for the important work that you're doing. I'm now going to hand over to Curtis and Evelyn from class 13 and look forward to hearing from both of you.
Thank you very much, Natalie. So I'm just gonna start with a little story to kind of frame our work. So when I was in year 9, I go on my friendship group at my school was having a house party. And at lunchtime, she was going around inviting people to her party. And when she came to me, she said, "You can come to my party as long as you don't steal anything." So I was taken back by this comment, and I obviously declined the invitation. But this interaction has kind of stayed with me until my adult years. So I think we can all agree that the education system is not meeting the needs of all the students. There's many organizations and charities set up to work directly with the students, often described as disadvantaged. Now, this approach places significant amount of responsibility for change on the student, and we understand that as deficit ideology. The deficit ideology doesn't just impact the most vulnerable students. Reflecting on my story, where did my friend learn that she should be cautious of me, and how does that impact how she navigates the world? It is our belief that as professionals, we have a duty of care to be a continual and active threat to inequality and alleviating some of that responsibility from the shoulders of our young students by recognizing our own role in educational inequality. Like a scientist who adds a smell to I got a little echo there. As a scientist that adds a smell to gas to alert us to danger, Class 13 seeks to add a feeling to inequality in schools. After all, nobody continues to watch EastEnders while they can still smell gas. You're on mute, Eb.
I did the classic thing. Thanks, Curtis. And I'm Evelyn, obviously. To follow on, at the moment, just over half of newly qualified teachers self-report a lack of confidence teaching in a multiracial classroom. In comparison to this, 81% of students in London are now from a minority ethnic background. So this is an issue that really needs addressing. Currently, our project addresses this problem through a programme of training that supports teachers and school leaders to feel the inequity in their schools, understand their individual role in that inequity, and take that learning back to their workplaces in order to create a learning environment where all students can express themselves freely. Our training is divided into 3 modules that participants can take over the course of several weeks or intensively over the course of several days, just depending on their availability. Our first module focuses on understanding how deficit thinking places the burden of inequity on students, and the second supports teachers to build their anti-racist practice in the classroom. Our third and final module examines racism in the context of safeguarding, and we think together about the harm that we as professionals can cause if our professional judgments come from a place of prejudice. Lots of interventions exist to combat inequity directly with students, but at Class 13, we believe students will feel the most impact when the teachers that they see every day are equipped to embed this type of work in their own classrooms. The average teacher interacts with an average of 250 students a week, and we know that the ripple effect of our work will be felt by these students as their teachers transform their practice to become active threats to inequality.
Thank you, Curtis and Evelyn. I had the pleasure of meeting Curtis over an FEA dinner last night, and we were talking a bit, and Curtis was saying that, you know, sometimes it is difficult to kind of sell the idea or the importance of teacher quality and teacher training. And from an evidence-based point of view, Curtis and Evelyn, I think you need to keep stressing the fact that outside of the home, outside of the family, the quality of the teacher in the classroom is the most important factor in a child's attainment and outcomes. And so it's brilliant to see the work you're doing on looking at equality in teaching quality. So thank you for that. Finally, we're going to hear from Will, who is from the well, I'm not quite sure if your organisation is Many Hands or the Re-Engagement Project, but I'm sure that you are about to tell us.
Hi, let's call it the Re-Engagement Project. Hi, I'm Will Ross. I've spent the last 10 years working in mainstream schools and outreach teams, trying to prevent children getting excluded, as well as in pupil referral units and alternative provision, trying to reintegrate those students who don't need to be outside of the system. From this experience, I decided to create the Re-Engagement Project. Over 50% of secondary schools have in-school behaviour units or internal alternative provision. Despite this, there is a limited research or guidance on how to run these units effectively. The children in these units are often some of the most vulnerable. These units can be effective safety nets to prevent exclusion and support families if run well. The Re-Engagement Project is a systemic framework with guidance, training and support for in-school alternative provision. The aim is to enable all children to overcome challenges, re-engage and then thrive in mainstream education through authentic collaboration with their family and wider network, and therefore reduce exclusions. From my experience, children are often seen as the problem, or the problem is inside them and it needs to be fixed. The solutions out there often focus on that. The view of the Re-Engagement Project is these problems are a manifestation of issues and challenges within the wider system. And for that reason, the framework of the re-engagement project is context-based. The context of the school has to be understood for the unit to be effective, but also the context of each child also needs to be understood to help them thrive within the school. It needs to be asset focused. The assets of the child and their system, encompassing their family, the school, and wider community, must be central to enabling the child to succeed within the school. And finally, it has to be partnership driven. It is essential the child and their system, including multi-agency professionals, collaborate positively and authentically to co-construct targets and solutions. The framework has 3 key phases. Firstly is the analysis and synthesis phase, creating a profile of the child's system with co-constructed targets through assessments, analysis of existing information, and meetings with the child and the system around that child. The second phase is the participation and intervention phase, using information from phase 1 to work with the child and their system through targeted intervention activities. And finally, there is the transition and sustainability phase, where the child is fully reintegrated into the mainstream school with appropriate sustainable actions and support for them and their system. My experience of what is out there at the moment is often that first phase, understanding the child and their needs and the system's challenges, is ignored, and that final phase, there is not enough thought put into it. We need to understand that child's needs, and then we need to support them going forward, not for a limited period. We're not going to be able to undo years of challenges and trauma with a 12-week program. And that's why this framework is necessary. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Will. And again, what's really struck me is that each of the 3 award winners that we've just heard from are all focused on some of the most relevant, topical and worrying issues facing education today. We've got about 10 minutes for me to put some questions to the award winners, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor. So if you have any specific questions you'd like to ask, can you please either raise your hand or put them in the chat, and we'll aim to come to you in a moment. But my first question from the chair is to Sinead. And I wonder, Sinead, can you tell us a bit more about why innovation is needed in your area?
Yeah, of course. I will keep this fairly brief so that we do get some time for questions. But I suppose what we're hearing from what you're hearing in the room and what we're seeing is that despite all of our efforts, the same groups of young people are consistently being left behind, whether that is children in care, Black Caribbean boys. There are groups that are consistently facing significantly worse outcomes than their peers. So as you know, I work specifically with children in care, so I'll speak from that angle, but there are, of course, learnings that translate across many groups of vulnerable young people. There's a couple of things that shape the context around why it's so important, which Natalie, I think you started speaking about in your introduction. So in the majority of cases, outcomes aren't improving. And actually, you mentioned we're starting to see inequalities rising. So that's showing us the status quo is simply not good enough. In terms of the outcomes for children in residential care, you heard me talk about how drastically worse they are with regards to education and homelessness and involvement in the criminal justice system. To the extent that if I were a parent and my child were facing these outcomes, I'd likely be considered at risk of having my child taken into state care because I would be deemed potentially not doing the best for them. So these are some of the most vulnerable and they deserve to be well supported. And secondly, the demand is rising relentlessly and there's more and more pressure on resources and spending. So year on year, the number of looked after children is increasing. And with budgets tight and demand increasing, there are limited resources. And that means that attention has to be and should be placed on those with the highest needs. But it can mean then that earlier stage interventions are overlooked because there's just not the resource and funding there. And investment in those earlier stage pieces can have a significant long-term impact by preventing escalating needs and risks and costs. So what we see is simply trying to do more of the same with increased pressure on resources and demand isn't going to bring about the change we need. So that's why innovation is so important. And while the pandemic has brought about a huge number of challenges in how we work and support the most vulnerable, it's also shown there's fantastic opportunities for innovation. We've seen services responding really creatively and ambitiously, and we've started having a conversation about how we can do things differently. So I think it's so important that we take these learnings and move forward with these innovations and find different ways so that we can be best meeting the needs of these really vulnerable groups of young people and families.
Thank you so much for that, Sinead. Curtis and Evelyn, can you tell us a bit about some of the challenges that you've come across in making progress in your area?
First up or me?
I thought it was you first.
I go first.
Go on.
So I guess like thinking about this question, I'd like to kind of read a quote from Martin Luther King, because I feel like the challenges that we're facing kind of he identified in his fight for civil rights, and it kind of resonates within education, where he saw the stride towards freedom was not the KKK, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action. Meaning that we seek to make small adjustments to a system to avoid like tension, but the tension is already there. So it's more of a reallocation of tension. And that's, I guess, like why we decide to work directly with teachers and directly with schools to focus on their role. And there's obviously lots of conversations about what government's doing and what funding happens. But the thing that we always have to realize is the impact is felt by the teacher, by the school, by those children in the classroom. So we need to think about that. And I guess my last point would be, we have to kind of think about we have to have a pedagogy of refusal. Like we're going to have to, at some point, if the system is going to change, there's going to be tension, is probably my point, but I think everything's got a second one.
Yeah, just to follow on from that, and I think I'm actually going to roll the question that Anna has asked in the chat into my response a little bit. I think a big challenge in supporting the most vulnerable children and young people is you can think about it a bit like a seesaw. We have lots and lots of work with students, so they're all sitting on one end of the seesaw, and we have very few organizations working with professionals, and it's actually great to have some people working with professionals as well in the room today. So until we get more people on this end of the seesaw, until we can get to a more even keel, we're not going to be able to see the impact that we want to see in supporting these children and young people. And to give a very quick example of that, and apologies to anyone who was at dinner with Curtis or I last night and may have heard this story already, but we used to work in a school with young people directly, where we cultivated critical thinking skills with the young people. And out of their learning with us, they decided to critically engage with some school rules that they felt were unfair at their school, and were punished. They made a petition which they wanted to give to senior leadership about some school uniform rules, and they were excluded for doing so. And that really showed us, if we do this work with the students, and if we're making them resilient and critical thinkers and making them all these wonderful things we want them to be, we as professionals have to be ready for that. We have to actually be ready for them to be these co-creators, like they were talking about in the keynote this morning, around having a part in what education looks like. And that's always going to be a challenge until we start equipping ourselves as much as we equip the students. We think it will always be a challenge.
Thank you, Evelyn. And yes, we did. Curtis did relay that incident of that particular school, which was quite shocking to hear last night. Finally, over to Will. And Will, can you tell us a bit about how you think the sector can better support the work you're doing?
I think a key element is about sharing effective practice. There is a lot going on in schools. Like we said, over 50% of schools have these units, but at the moment, schools are having to plough their own furrow and follow their own kind of instincts and intuition. And sadly, that instinct and intuition isn't always appropriate. I've seen schools where they make children in these units dress differently, wear different clothes, come in different entrances. So I've no doubt that maybe those things were done with the best of intentions, but we know that they do not create inclusive, supportive schools where vulnerable children can be successful. So I think one of the key things is about sharing what is good practice, and linked to that is this idea of collaboration. So we are working together, not just schools, but third sector agencies, multi-agency professionals are genuinely collaborating and not duplicating. There's a lot of duplication of different ideas, of similar projects, but actually what we need to do is to come together and think about how we can work together to have joined up thinking on how to support these children, but also the systems around these children. How do we support the families? How do we support multi-agency professionals to meet their goals, but also help us meet the goals that we have within schools? Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Will. So I'm just going to take about 5 minutes for questions now before we wrap up. We've got a question from James saying, do you think the education system does enough to join up professionals for children and young people? Which is the point Will was just making. If not, what more can be done? So Will, Evelyn, Curtis and Sinead, do any of you want to come in on that one?
I'm happy to just to relay my experience, really. I think the difficulty is we all have similar goals, but different goals. Like CAMS are focused on mental health, social care are focused on safeguarding and safety, schools are focused on learning and attainment. So although they're similar goals and they're about the well-being of the child, they are slightly different. And the problem is sometimes we don't recognize that as professionals. And I think we need to be more open to having those different goals and working out a route of working better together. It is incredibly challenging. I've seen firsthand the negativity and conflict within the system, between these multi-agency professionals, and it is challenging because everyone works in their silos. My idea is about bringing it together on a smaller scale. I'll be honest, maybe the others may have better ideas on how to do it on a bigger scale. I think it is a real challenge.
Thank you. Do any of the others want to come in on that? Okay. Fiona from the National Governance Association, you have your hand up. Over to you.
Hiya, yeah, thanks, Natalie. So my question is for Curtis and Evelyn. I work for the National Governance Association, and we support governors and trustees and school leaders strategically in the strategical kind of planning of and running of their schools. Now, I have just come from 16 years in the education sector, predominantly in pupil referral units and alternative provisions. And one of the challenges that I found was obviously the disproportionate rate of exclusion rate of particularly Black Caribbean, in the area where I worked, also Black African children and mixed Caribbean. And I was invited to a board meeting with the Children's Services in Sandwell to discuss kind of how we can have a preventative approach to exclusions. And there was lots of talk about mentor programs, a little bit like what you were saying, Evelyn, lots of talk about mentoring programs, and it just really frustrated me, because I was like, well, the board that I'm sitting around, for starters, doesn't represent the community that we are serving. The senior leadership within the schools doesn't represent the community that we're serving. And we talk so much about all these, as you say, putting the burden on the children to change. Actually, it's almost kind of like not individual teachers, but systemically teachers behaving badly rather than children behaving badly.
I wonder, just in the interest of time.
Sorry, yeah.
Question.
It was just really, how do you address, because there's a lot of resistance. There's lots of willingness to address racism, direct and overt racism, but a lot of resistance to address systemic racism. And I'm just wondering, how do you address that with the schools and the school leaders that you work with?
So it is a tough challenge, and one of the things, and this speaks to Sam's question as well about like not just being sporadic. So we work on a thing where we're saying we're going to work with the 20% of people who want to do it, and then there's a 40% people, or 60% people in the middle who will kind of go in that direction, go with the path of least resistance, and there's the 20% which are going to be like, no, we don't want to do it. So we're not going to spend our time working with that 60%. That's why we say we open it and say we're trying to build this model. Who wants to be part of it? And the thing that we also look at is schools and teachers. Like, we want the best outcomes for young people. If we can get the best outcomes for young people without being overly punitive, and like teachers being happy in their classrooms and engaging with the community, then we'll do that. So if we can show that as a model of best practice, then other schools will jump on board, because that's the outcome they want. I don't believe any school really wants to be really overly punitive. So.
Thank you, Curtis. And I think you came in just on time, because I have a feeling we're going to be kicked out of this breakout room in a moment. So Shine, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much to Natalie, Curtis, Sinead, Will, for such a stimulating discussion. And a big thank you to everyone in the room for your brilliant questions and reflections. We will shortly be heading back to the main room to share reflections and offers of support for our award winners. So please keep them handy for sharing. And yeah, in particular, if there's anyone who wants to share an offer of support, let me know. I can come to you in the main room. But yeah, otherwise just keep it top of mind so you can share back. And yeah, we have about 7 seconds. See you in the plenary.